We are to test all things and hold fast what is good. But how do we test? Seeing if something can stand up. We identify the weakness, and when we look at now something that's finished, especially as a Christian, are we evaluating it if the work will hold up? Or now are we going to apply a morality to it and judge it? Then pass sentence. So when we judge, we're often giving this negative response. But he will test to see if something is true or not true.
Well, hello, everybody, once again, and welcome to the Audacious Faith Podcast, the movement of audacious faith that we're inspiring people all across the country and even worldwide. This is what God calls us to, amen? And in all areas of life, I'm excited today because I have a guest, and we're going to be discussing a subject that in 100-something plus episodes, I don't think we've touched on at all. So I'm fired up about that. My guest today, he's somebody who has a great background in art and also as far as the Bible and ministry is concerned. He actually grew up as a pastor's kid, so he has that background. Yet at the same time, he's been an art teacher. He's also studied the arts and how it relates to the scripture quite a bit. And so I want to go into this area today. He's also married, been married for over 20 years. And I'm just so happy that he's joining us via Zoom today. It's Rick Sorenson. Rick, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm really looking forward to it.
Yeah, I want to get into the discussion. Kind of maybe share a little bit. So you grew up as a pastor's kid, so you're very familiar with all of that. Just real briefly before we even get into it, how was it growing up as a pastor's kid?
It has its good sides and its bad sides. I could never get away with anything.
Yeah.
And I mean, if other people in the church didn't tell my folks, God kind of had a way of revealing it to them as well.
Exactly. Did you find did it seem like people in the church felt it was their duty for some reason to report everything that they caught you doing?
Not necessarily, but you know, even as a teenager, I remember this incident where I was driving back from doing this farm job, and there was another guy, and we were out in the middle of nowhere in farm country, and I was speeding. And so I passed somebody who was in the church that I didn't even see at the time. Yeah. And then my dad told me later, what was going on with you? Speeding out there. Yeah. So, things like that would happen to me all the time.
Amazing. It's like, is God like sending messages from above and viewing or what, right? It's amazing how things don't get away with. Well, let's go ahead and kind of go into your journey here. You're a visual artist turned author, and you've written a book. The book is entitled Art, the Church's Response. What inspired you? Kind of what went into you wanting to write this book to begin with?
There were a couple things. My journey writing began probably around 2000-ish. Okay. Not this book, but just the fact that I started writing. That wasn't something that was anything that I really desired to do. But I was driving to work one day. I was hanging wallpaper at the time. And as I'm driving to work and I'm stuck in rush hour traffic, this voice tells me I should write that book I've had in mind. So I come back home at the end of the day. I tell my wife. She gave me a stenographer's pad. And so then I filled that up that weekend.
Nice.
And there was a couple of things going on with that. One, I began to work out some of how I viewed art. It was the topics I was dealing with was more along the nature of the arts and how we interact with that and respond to it. So that began to just, clarify a lot of things in my head. And I began to learn how to write as I was writing. I grew up in an American high school. I wasn't in the smart classes. So for me, writing was not was not anything that came easy.
Sure.
And so it was just me slogging it out, trying to bring clarity to my thinking. And if I could bring clarity, then other people would understand what I'm trying to convey.
Absolutely.
And so that was like the first stage. And then what led to this book was I've been part of an artist conference for about 25 years.
Okay.
And so I and one other couple that we know of are the only Christians in this organization of artists. Mm-hmm. And so this couple, the Conrads, they are one of the premier manufacturers of art printing presses. So there's only two main printing press manufacturers in the United States, and they're one of them, and they're Christian. Okay. And so, we got to know each other over the course of the years. And so it's always, a happy time to see them.
Yeah.
And so this one conference then said, let's go have coffee. So as we're catching up and having coffee, then they tell me, you should write that book to Christians you've had in mind. Mm-hmm. And so I began to think about that. And if I were to write a book to Christians, then what would Christians want to know about? And sure. That's kind of how the book began. Just thinking about doing that. And so for the Conrads saying that, I really saw that as the Holy Spirit just saying, you need to do this now.
Absolutely.
And so that's what began the writing of this book.
Gotcha. Well, I think that you're touching on something very important, Rick, and that is that as we are led by God, as we hear that still small voice, in your case, it was on the road, it's important to actually respond to it, right? I think there's probably a lot of believers out there that the Lord kind of put something there and they fight it, they ignore it, they, give all the reasons why they're not capable. Like you said, you weren't a writer. That's not something that you normally did. Just like I look in the Old Testament and Moses was told to go to Pharaoh and he wasn't a speaker either. But, still, God had his plan. He always knows what he's doing. So I'm glad that you followed the call and obeyed and actually started writing down and doing it. How did your experiences, so here you have this art background, you're a creative person, and yet you have the faith background. You mentioned that, that wasn't that common in the circle where you were at. So how does the combination of those two, did it go into the ideas of what you put in the book? Did you have that in mind?
So I wrote the book from a biblical Christian point of view, okay. But it's basically an aesthetics book on how to understand art, but from a Christian perspective.
Okay.
Over the last 20 years, there's been greater acceptance of art and the arts in churches than there had been before. Okay. And I kind of trace it back to Francis Schaeffer in the 70s and the people that he influenced at that time as the start of our modern acceptance of art in churches.
Okay.
And so and of course he had a great influence on me as a young man reading his book Art in the Bible, because I as a teenager wanted to see what the Bible talked about art. Sure. Because that was my desire.
Right.
And so he really showed that the art that the Bible does not condemn art. Mm-hmm. And so that really led me as a young Christian into a greater desire to pursue the arts, because and then as I began to go through art training, both craft-wise of learning how to get across ideas so that other people can understand them in a visual way, then reading all the other stuff related to that helped me to clarify things. And for this book, so that's background for this book, that as I began to look at more specifically different topics that the Bible touches on as it relates to creativity and the arts, then even greater clarity of how the church responds to that began to form in me.
Well, let me ask you this real quick.
Okay.
Let's clarify a little bit on the arts, okay? Because I know there's various forms of the arts. You're mentioning the arts. I know that, I mean, I've been a pastor for a long time at this point, and I've seen some changes in that area, of course. So I go to some churches, for example, and some of the arts I see that, I mean, I see people dancing while songs are going. I see flags going. I see all kinds of things that I never would have seen before. It's very new for me. At first, I was in marching band and I was a musician. So I'm thinking, it reminds me of flag team. And it's like, what? It looks weird to me. But is that what we're talking about with the arts? Are we talking more visual arts? What are, or is it all?
I actually have a holistic point of view towards that. I most of the time when I talk about art, I'm meaning it in the holistic sense of encompassing everything that we do.
Gotcha.
And there are times that I will put it to more specifically to the visual sense. But often I've come to just use it in a more holistic way. And this is the creative works that we do. It's what we generally term as art. So more specifically to the things that you've observed, some of the acceptance of the art has to do with, I mean, you mentioned dancing and flags, which has been popular for the last, I think, 20 years or a little more, especially with flags. That stems more from kind of a Hebrew background and so that was kind of brought over from that point of view of dancing with flags and stuff. There's symbolic uses of flags, of colors, of patterns that are done. That can be both prayer and it can be a symbol of, whatever the topics that they're covering. Like in church.
That helps me because I think, when I'm asking that question, especially you're trying to get this message out there. And I think, somebody like me doesn't understand that. So it helps me to go, oh, there's actually a connection here. This was done in, the Hebrew, because otherwise I'm thinking, where did this come from? You know what I mean? So it really does help to kind of know that and what it means and why it's being done. So I appreciate that.
Yeah. Some of the other dance aspect that I've seen would fall closer to a contemporary style of dance, but in more of a symbolic way, maybe representing either atonement or, what the blood has done for the person individually. I've seen it both corporate and as an individual expression.
Got it.
But yeah, I tried to write my book so that person that doesn't have any understanding at all would understand what I'm talking about.
Well, that's extremely helpful. Now, you mentioned also that, I mean, we're made in God's image, obviously. And part of that image is that God is a creator, right? And so he's put creativity. So all the things as we're made in God's image. I mean, for instance, God is a God who loves. We don't understand that love completely, but we have a capacity to love. We have a capacity he's a God of wrath at times. We get angry. But we do it sinfully more than he does it obviously perfectly. So, and same thing with creativity. He's given us the ability to create. And there's some incredibly creative people with different gifts in the world. So how can Christians embrace this aspect of their identity that God has given these creative gifts to, realizing that this is part of how God made them and this is what he wants them to do?
Well, I think this is an incredibly important point, that if you think about it, the very first way that God reveals himself to us in Genesis 1:1 is as creator. In the
Yes.
beginning, God created. That's the very first way he reveals himself.
Right.
And then, a couple of chapters later, he says, let us make man in our own image. Part of that image, as you're just saying, is that we are also a creator. And so if God put creativity into us, because he has it and he made us in his image, and part of that is that we are creative. We have to create. There is always creativity that is coming out of us in some way. And so I think that's one of the main things that the devil will try to target in us. The enemy hates God and has to destroy God's image in us. If he can't kill us when we're babies, then he has to now go through more involved things of try to separate us from the image of God in us. And so one of the main things I think he does is to separate us from our creativity. I think this is one of the major lies that we accept. And so how does that happen? Well, society, all throughout society, people are told that you're not creative, you can't do it, you're never going to succeed. All of these things that target identity are also targeting our creativity. Because how can we now fulfill that creativity if we're told we can't do it? And so for us now to accept that this is part of who God made us to be, we are now identifying with God in this aspect. And as we interact with the Holy Spirit into what he gives us, and we began to now carry out those ideas, those images that he's giving to us to do, we'll do it imperfectly, but we'll be doing it.
Right.
And the more training we have, the more refining of talent we get, the clearer will be the expression of our creativity.
Okay.
And so we have to go through this process of first accepting that we have creativity in us. If you remember the movie, let's see. Oh, what was that Whoopi Goldberg movie where she was a nun? My mind just blanked out.
Sister Act.
Sister Act. Well, Sister Act 2, she comes back and is the teacher in this Catholic high school in San Francisco. And, there's an incredible singer in the school. And she wants to help nurture that gift. And the mother is telling the daughter that, no, you're not going to be a singer. That if you start singing, I'm pulling you out of choir. There's things like that go on all the time. And, the mother's motivation was out of fear because of what happened to her husband as a singer and him not succeeding. She didn't want that for her daughter. So her motivation was based upon fear of what would happen. But the outcome is that the girl had to now hide this creativity, this need to express herself from her mother, who was telling her, you're not going to do that.
Right.
Well, that's a common type of thing that you'll see in society. You'll see it in family relationships like that. You'll see it in more overview of, larger groups in society.
Right.
The other aspect that targets our creativity is school.
Mm-hmm.
When kids enter school at kindergarten, first grade, preschool, they're super creative.
Yeah.
They can't help but, make something.
Right.
They have to sing. They're doing make-believe. They're, every aspect is creativity pouring out of them in some fashion.
Mm-hmm.
By the time we graduate, then most people, school teaches that there's only one right answer. That's what testing is all about, making you conform and making you know that there's only one right answer.
Mm-hmm.
But creativity, there's many right answers. As we're looking for solutions to doing things, that's one thing that art taught me. There's many right answers to express this idea.
Gotcha. No, that makes complete sense. So I'm thinking the need for, and that's why I think your book is so important, because the need for people of faith, genuine believers, to use the creativity. Let's face it, a lot of non-people of faith are using creativity all the time. We see it in celebrities, musicians,
Right.
and art, and movies, and all of this. They're using it. I mean, because obviously they're also created in the image of God. They're just a way, and so they're using it and expressing it, and people are following them, and the messages aren't necessarily that which draws people towards God. So, how important is it then for people of faith to use these same abilities of creativity that God has placed in us to express and draw people towards Him?
Oh, I think it's incredible. If you think in history of the great artworks, some of the makers of great artworks, say from the Renaissance forward, Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci,
Right.
We look at that and we say, the work is incredible.
Right.
And we respond to it now in the same way its original audience responded to it way back then.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you have that longevity, or if you think of music with Bach, his work was so deep that it changed music to develop into the form that we're familiar with.
Sure.
But we don't think about going to that depth. We stay shallow in what we express.
Yeah.
And so for a Christian to not only now depict the cross or redemption or these other main topics that we like to talk about and preach about, which is good. We need to have clear understanding of it, but the visual arts will give a way to relate to it that we don't normally think about. I'm thinking off the top of my head, there's a picture from, I can't remember the artist's name, but there's a depiction of Jesus after he was resurrected, and he's in the meeting room where he appeared to the apostles.
Mm-hmm.
It was a closed room, and then he appears, and he takes the apostle that said, only way that I'll believe that he was here is if I put my finger in his wound.
Right. That would be doubting Thomas. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So there's a artist depicted that of Jesus taking his hand and putting it into the wound.
Okay.
To visually see that is a whole lot different than to just hear about it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I agree.
And so that's one of the things that visual artists can do is they can present, in a sense, a side of what we know, but in a way that we don't often think about.
Yeah.
Songs will do the same thing. I mean, we could talk about that even for theater as well.
Right. Yeah. So many aspects. Hey, I'm curious. I don't know if you've given any thought to this. We didn't discuss any of this ahead of time, but you mentioned something that I thought was kind of key. You mentioned that kids come into school, they're very creative. I mean, they even kind of encourage that in kindergarten and everything with the
Oh
arts.
yeah, right.
But then it starts changing over time. And I'm thinking of examples because I think school-wise kind of just institutionalizes everybody a certain way of thinking. Um,
Exactly.
and let's take so I'm thinking of, like, for instance, these unusual cases that stand out. I'm thinking of a young man, for instance, who, I don't know if you ever watch America's Got Talent, but there is a young man, his name is Cody Lee. He actually is autistic, incredible musician, able to write songs, sing, even though he can't talk that well,
Hmm.
play the piano, just incredible
Right.
abilities. I'm thinking of someone like an Elon Musk, for instance, who's come up with all of these inventions and interventions,
Hmm.
who has Asperger's. Um,
Yeah.
so it seems to me that often when people have things that cause them maybe not to be able to fall into the institutionalized lines, and the creativity is able to flow, that these are some of the
Hmm.
people that God just does incredible things through.
Oh yeah, I think so because um, well, we're not lockstepped into thinking,
Right.
and that's what school teaches us to stay into this narrow, confined way of thinking.
Just draw within the lines, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
When along that point of view, when um, people, and this happens to every visual artist,
Okay.
someone will meet them and they say, "Oh, I'm an artist," and involuntarily they will tell them, "Oh, I can't even draw a straight line, or I can't even draw a stick figure." I can't tell you how many people have told me that.
That would be me. Yeah.
Well, that comes from intimidation
Hmm.
in yourself because, uh, along with the, um, school taking or confining creativity in us, there's a biological development that happens in children, where as they're growing and maturing, the brain is developing. And
Right.
around 8 to 10, the brain develops from concrete thinking that a child has, this is this,
Yeah.
to more abstract thinking, where this is that. And it's kind of in this transition time that happens. And one of the ways to track this is through children's drawings.
Hmm.
And so, I mean, with young children, we've all had this type of experience where you're looking at the child's drawing and say, "Oh, that's a nice horsey." And they'll say, "Oh, that's not a horsey," and goes into this big, long thing.
Right.
They say, "Oh, yes, I see it. I'm sorry."
Uh-huh.
We've all kind of said that.
Yeah.
After that, as the brain is transitioning and they're looking now outside of the inner language of themselves into the outer world, and they're making these associations of things. And so, in drawing wise, they now want what they are depicting to be what they're seeing. And so,
Right.
whether it's something from a magazine or a figurine, or whatever they're wanting to do, they'll try to do it. And if it doesn't come out the way they think it should, then they'll get frustrated.
Yeah.
And they'll keep doing it, and over time, this frustration will just kind of grow in them until it reaches a saturation point. And that's when that happens. That's where the child will say, "I hate drawing. I can't do this."
Hmm.
Uh, I My term for this is the quitting stage. Um, at this point, child may go into other areas of creativity, like music. If they've had music lessons, then they'll concentrate all their energy into this other creative area.
Yeah.
But every kid starts out drawing. everyone. And so it's a key indicator of where they're at.
Yeah, what you're saying sounds like my story, quite honestly, because I can remember being in kindergarten and traumatized because we were a couple of factors, basically. I was left-handed and mostly there was right-handed scissors. Okay. And the left-handed scissors were horrible. They didn't cut anything.
Okay? Yeah. My mom tied my left hands.
Oh, so you were left-handed. You're left-handed as well. Okay.
Well, I use both now, but.
Got it. Well, and so then I remember they had these, like, we were supposed to cut out like the shape of these gingerbread men out of a paper. Okay.
Yeah.
I kept cutting the legs off. I couldn't figure out how to, and so that was the first step right there. And then I remember we were drawing pictures, and there was my best friend in the class drew these amazing pictures. I just remember it. It was like showing the ocean and the seashore, like the sand and all of that, and it looked like what it was supposed to look like. And when I would try to do something like that, it just looked like a mess,
Yeah.
And so early on, I think, even though nobody necessarily, I don't remember anyone telling me, early on, I told myself, you're just not good at art. You're just not.
Yeah.
And I did go into music. I became very good at music, honestly, and I still use it to this day. So my creativity kind of went that way. Is there an aspect where maybe I was correct, where maybe God didn't make me where I would be good at that aspect, but another, or did I just shut it off? What do you think?
I think it's more the fact that you shut it off. Okay. But then the enemy helped you with inner voicing, saying, "Oh, you can't do it. Everyone else can, but not you." Because the enemy will always use that argument.
Yeah, that's true in everything in life, right? How come everybody else can do it, but I can't? And it's that type of lie, right?
Right. So we believe the lie, and we will shut off that area.
So what you're saying is I needed someone like you at that point, as an art teacher or something, that would come along and say, you can actually do it, but these are some things you need to try. These are some techniques you can use to get better at it.
Yeah. There's some people can just intuitively do it by themselves. They don't need a teacher.
Right.
Others that are like me, they needed the teacher to show them how to do it so that they could get past the blocks.
And have you seen that in your experience where the person really had it in them, but they just needed a little direction and a little belief from someone like you, and then it kind of unlocked it?
Yeah.
Gotcha.
Yeah. I mean, you see that in movies all the time where the mentor sees something and then they help to develop that.
Right. And then the person just stores from there.
Right.
Right. Well, let's look at another aspect in your book here. You mention the studying the words, the original language, that have to do with these artistic type of concepts, like a Hebrew word, I think, or something for this. You want to kind of explain that a little bit?
Sure. Well, in Genesis, the word for create in Genesis 1:1, God created the heavens and the earth, is bara. That's the Hebrew word. Okay. That means to create as a process. So, in the beginning, God created as a process the heavens and the earth. Mm-hmm. We don't, think of it that way, it brings out a little bit more to it than what we normally think about. Okay. And so if God had to create as a process, then that's everything we do is also a process of creating, of bringing the idea from something that's in our head to now to be a reality in whatever medium we choose to express that in. Okay. So it's always this process of going from idea to actuality. And how we do that is bara.
Gotcha. Okay. So I'm thinking when you're saying that, this process, because that's where people don't get a lot, because we're in a society now that wants things instantly. So, yes. So for example, I just recently had a meeting with someone and they were talking about a songwriting process. And this is something that's in an industry. Okay. And this is what I didn't know, because I've tried to write songs before, but then I get frustrated with it. I've done a few. And this person who's in the professional industry of this said that what people don't realize is that a good songwriter, for every 100 songs they write, only like 2 or 3 of them end up being really good, that it
Yeah,
hit, right?
right,
Where we're just thinking, oh, they sat down, they wrote a song, and boom, it's done, right? So there's this process that you're mentioning.
right.
uh and it's true. I mean, for instance, if we look at uh car vehicles that come out and all that, so these car models and everything, they have prototypes and things
Hmm.
before that, right? So
Right,
there's like that they test on a market, and they survey and they see. So
right.
this idea of instant, is
Hmm.
that what you're touching on? That it's more of a development process, a creative process?
Well, every medium kind of defines how that process is approached.
Okay.
Music is something that deals with time,
Hmm.
where the visual arts, they're not. They deal with um, space. Some aspects might deal with time,
Okay.
and I mean that there's sequential things like movie is a visual art that are sequential pictures on film or
Right.
now digital that go from a beginning to an end, and the story lasts as long as that happens. So that's a sequential, or that's a time aspect to that creative area,
Right.
and that's what movies and books do. We're all sitting, waiting for the story to complete as we go through time, from either reading it or watching it or hearing it,
Hmm.
to listen to the whole.
Yeah.
And the impact only hits us when we have finished the whole.
Mm.
Of, I mean, different aspects of it really, that what really hits me,
Hmm.
as music can do so well. But we don't really have the whole impact until the whole is complete.
Yeah. So
Uh, a picture is a little different. The impact hits us all at once
okay.
without a time aspect to it.
Gotcha.
It's much more of a gestalt um, impact, where we receive the whole at once, but it may take us time to understand or even to go through what that means.
Significance. Okay. Nice. So I'm thinking what you're saying there in the whole. So for example, let's say I get a book, okay,
Mm-hmm.
and it's this creative story. Worst thing you can do is tell me the end of the story,
Yeah,
right? I mean, or you know what? Oh, here's the book. Okay, let me go to the end. Let me see what happens. All right.
right.
I mean, it's missing without the whole of it, right?
Yeah,
Which kind of culminates to that. So, and that's why a person doesn't just write like an intro and then the end.
right.
There's everything that's in between. So, um, now let's just touch on a couple things. We have a few more minutes here. Um, you've mentioned that since the 70s, there's been a turning point for Christians when it comes to the arts. It's kind of becoming a little bit more mainstream, a little bit more accepted. What do you see as the biggest changes since that time?
Overall, a more openness to the arts by the church.
Okay.
Um, but the one thing is that there's still a misunderstanding about it, either by leaders in the church, and so um, it has to be controlled.
Hmm.
That's um, that's one of the things that I see, that there's a control aspect to it. Um,
So they fearing that it's going to be doctrinally off, that it's going to be just like, something crazy. Is that what there seemed to be a hesitancy there?
could be. I think it's just generally not quite understanding it.
Got it.
And then if you're intimidated, if you still have this intimidation from childhood with it,
Hmm.
and what the enemy has done to you through that intimidation, and where you've now cut off a lot of the creativity, then you as a leader now are coming in with this um, damaged area. And how are you able to evaluate was being done in a creative way.
Right.
So
Right.
you can't. Now you have to judge it according to some type of morality.
Okay.
And of course, as Christians, we would say, the morality is the Bible.
That's what
And
should be the standard. Yes.
and there is some small type of truth to that, because we're not going to put just anything up.
Sure.
But that also means that you might be keeping back the person that's needing to not be kept back.
Right. Well, I feel exactly what you're saying, because that was my background. Although I am creative in music and all of those type of things, but I come from my ministry background is a Baptist background, and for example, dance. I was told early on, oh, Baptists don't dance. Okay, they
Yeah.
just don't have dances. They don't do that type of thing. That's just the code. That's just the way it is. And then, of course, because of the fact that I didn't really dance much and I don't dance well, I would joke around and say, well, I'm the reason Baptists don't dance, because they'd end up dancing
Right.
like me. But then last year my daughter was getting married, and years before I had seen my brother-in-law and my niece, and they did like the traditional father-daughter dance, and then it broke into all these songs and they did all this kind of thing. And when I saw that, I thought, one day when my daughter gets married, I would really like to do that. And so we had a friend and we actually took 10 dance lessons over like 10 weeks, getting ready for
Right.
the whole routine, right? Which went really well. I mean, honestly, went really well. It was a whole lot of fun. It was a great memory I made with her, that, is on video and she'll always remember it. And
Yeah.
so I have no regrets whatsoever. But the funny thing about it was there were a few people, they didn't say anything, but there was like a few people in a certain table that even my wife and different ones afterwards going, well, you just got off their Christmas card list, for,
Right.
thing you do that. And there was nothing wrong with it. It was all good. But
I think you're bringing up something important, and that is the difference of testing to judging.
yeah,
The Bible, the New Testament says several times that we are to test all things and hold fast what is good.
sure.
But how do we test? Testing has to do with seeing if something can stand up with any weakness. We identify the weakness, and if we identify it in the process of making, then we'll take away that weakness and put strength in it, in
Right.
whatever way that will mean for what we are doing. And so when we look at now something that's finished, especially as a Christian, are we evaluating it? And I use that word evaluate to mean, are we testing it?
Okay.
Are we testing to see if the work will hold up? Or now are we going to apply a morality to it and judge it? And then pass sentence, because that's what judging does, is it passes a sentence.
Yes.
There's a verbal sentencing. Sentencing isn't always positive. It's usually negative. So when we judge, we're often giving this negative response. If Paul said he didn't even judge himself,
Right.
then he's not going to pass that sentence on himself. But he will test to see if something is true or not true.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And I think that's what we can do. What we have done is we've confused personal bias with, and you mentioned dance. I think that's a good example, that dance by the church has often been condemned.
Yeah.
And especially, in our lifetime.
They would have thrown David in the Bible out of the church, right? Because he
exactly
decided, right?
And so they didn't test to see if dancing is allowed in the Bible, which, if you read enough of it, you see it is. In different settings, then there's dancing that's happened.
Yeah.
And knowing enough of the Middle Eastern culture, that's basically, that cultural aspect of dance has stayed in no in all of the Arab and the Israeli cultural aspects. They all have that same type of cultural aspect of how they use dance. So it's often celebration, often in weddings. There's different uses for it. In the church, it's gotten, I think Footloose, that came out when I was.
We're dating ourselves here, yes.
Yeah.
It's been a while.
So for its time, that perfectly mirrored the way Christians saw dance. And actually, it touches on censorship and the other arts, and it dealt with that accurately in many ways. And so Footloose, as it was about celebration of life and being young.
Yeah.
That's what the end of the movie is them celebrating that. Mm-hmm. But all the arguments in Footloose were stuff I heard in church.
Sure. And I'm sure that's why they put it in there.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so was that just a cultural bias because you don't want any sexual stuff going on, and dance is a way of releasing some of that energy? So no, we have to condemn that because, that will cause people to get too weak.
Right.
And so what I see is the confusion of temptation to actual sin. That temptation is a test to see how you're going to do. And if you don't pass the test, God's really gracious and will let you take many makeup tests over that same issue.
Right. Absolutely. Well, Rick.
So I'll give you an example of the song that a worship song that I've always had trouble with.
Okay.
That I use to test. So the song "Open the Eyes of My Heart" came out it was written like 20 years ago or so.
Sure.
Open the eyes of my heart, Lord. Open the eyes of my heart. I want to see you. I want to see you. Now that's a good thing to express. We all want to have that desire to see God, to open the eyes of my heart. I don't have a problem with that part. What I have a problem with is the next one. Open the eyes of my heart, because I want to see you. To see you high and lifted up, shining in the light of your glory. Pour out your power and love as we sing, holy, holy, holy. Mm-hmm. I think this song would be more biblically correct if you take out "to see you" and replace it with "for you are." For you are holy. For you are high and lifted up. No, that's in Isaiah 6. You are high and lifted up, and the angels cry holy. When we say, I want to see you high and lifted up, where have we placed God at?
Oh, lower.
Lower.
And we're trying to, it's like we want to put him up there by singing holy, right?
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
Now, that's a minor thing. And you could look at other songs today and have greater things that you want to change.
Right.
And so, but that one's easy. I think easy to demonstrate why how the author didn't quite get it right. And if you have this minor change, his full intention will come out to it.
Gotcha.
And so it could be because when you're making stuff, sometimes you're too close to it. Mm-hmm. And you need to step back in order to really evaluate it more objectively.
Got it.
I'm guessing that's what happened with him. But I mean, he was trying to express this desire that God was really showing him at the time.
Right.
And it's a good desire that he was expressing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Just the full expression of it didn't come out to his intention.
Gotcha. No, great example. So let me ask this, because we're going to wrap up here, but I really enjoyed the conversation. I think it's a subject people need to look into more. So tell us how to get your book, because I think people should definitely check it out. It's something I want to check out as well. Where can we find it?
Well, it's on Amazon or Barnes & Noble. In fact, here's a copy of it. Here's the look of it.
Art, the Church's Response. I love it. By Rick
So, yeah, or any local bookstore can probably order it for you as well.
Okay. Well, we're going to try to put that link right in the bottom of this video and everything that goes. So I want to encourage our listeners that if you have been inspired by something, or this has piqued your interest today, maybe you've been, enlightened here to kind of look at things a little differently than before, and you want to expand into the whole subject there, pick up the book. It's definitely an area that God has placed within us. And so I encourage you to do that. And I also encourage you to share this podcast episode and many others with people that you think would benefit and be blessed by it. So until next time, this has been the Audacious Faith Podcast. May God continue to bless you all, and we will see you next time.
Thank you.